All right, so in this video, I'm going to be finishing up the last part of the code with me, the try except corrections, as well as go through Lab 08, walking through our reading and writing files with text files, binary files, and JSON files with the Streamlit conversion. All right, so we left off here with our step 6, where we were looking at the negative number error. When you guys ran it, for the most part, a lot of people were able to get the right solution, but I did not, so I just want to go ahead and show that. And then we'll also go ahead and show this one section here where we talk about step 7, where we use our main entry block to actually call our main method. So this is, or our main function. So this is where we're going to make a little bit of modification to our code. All right, so in this section, when we were talking about try except for our step 6, we created our own class, which we're able for us to be able to access and make our own error message. So in this case here, we created a negative number error class with some sort of exception that it accepts as a parameter. And then we obviously use our stub, our pass key here to just skip over because we don't have any code yet. But what we do have is we have a function that we created, the square root, taking in some value, and then we raise an error, which is using our negative number error message. So what we're passing in is an argument of value, a string value here, a literal string value that gets stored into the exception. And then here we see that we return the nth value times 0.5. And then we have below that function our try except statement where we call this function twice, printing out whatever gets returned. So that means if it is not a negative number, then it should have the square root of that specific number. If it's a negative number, then we should see our error message. And then in the except part, we're going to accept a negative number as E and then print that we caught our custom exception. And so we'll print that E exception out here. So when you actually run your code, what we would do is if I ran it right now, let me zoom in a bit. It doesn't say anything. It actually leaves up as our closing file. So most of you guys have probably figured this out. I just needed to, in this case, I can define this as a separate function, or I can just copy and paste this into our main. And I will place this here. And we'll go ahead and make sure we have the right indentation. And then we'll go ahead and run this code inside of our main function here that we have collected at the very top. So we're going to run that. Let's zoom in. And so now when we zoom in here to our output, we see that the number that we passed in first, which, scroll down, is 25. We get the square root of it, which is 5. But when we put a -4, we get our exception error message, caught custom exception, and then inside of that E is the actual exception that we gave to the user. And so it says caught custom exception. E is actually our exception that we raised inside of this function here, so the information. So we created our own error class. We can make modifications in it if we wanted to, but that's just a different way for us to actually use our try except. Now, the next thing we have here is actually we want to be able to have our own function call. We're going to have an entry point. So like I always say at the top, we want to call our main method. And so we have our main at the top. But you may have seen something like if space underscore underscore name. underscore underscore. We use our equivalence operator to compare the two. And then we have here a space and then a string, underscore underscore main, underscore underscore. And then we have our colon here. So in this point here, every Python file has a special built-in variable, okay? So in this case here, and let me make sure we indent it right. Yeah, so in this case here, we have name. And what is it actually saying? It behaves actually differently depending on how the file is used. So we can run the file directly, which is what this main is about here, or the file is going to be imported into another file name. So what this specific line says, this full line on 92, it says only run this code if this file is being executed directly and not imported. If we're saying that the main is being used directly and not necessarily imported. And since we do have our main function here, that's what it means. Now, this matters because everything runs automatically even when you import the file elsewhere. So with this, we can define functions classes that are reusable, but it also controls what runs when testing. So the reason why we're applying this in the assignment here is we want to be able to showcase the use of a main block, right? So in this case here, we want to welcome, let me go back to the instructions really quickly. Here we want to include our main block that prints a welcome message. So we want to print out a welcome message. And then we also want to call the function to demonstrate exception handling and then print a final message indicating successful completion. Now, since we already have our main method, what we're going to do here is at the very top of our main function, we're just going to print out some welcome message here. So I'm going to just say print, we'll say welcome to the square root, or I'm sorry, welcome to, this one would be code with me, 05, try accept. And then we also want to have an ending message. Since we already have all of our information here where we call different functions that we've defined. Now at the very end, we're going to just print out a successful message. We're going to print and then just say completed, code with me, 05, successfully done. And save. And then what we'll do is we will run this. And now we have in our comments here our whole entire block where we say welcome to code with me, and then we have our code with me successfully done. So this is the end of that code with me code. And so we learned syntax. We learned the syntax of try except. We learned how to divide a number by using try except, especially if there's a zero division there. We learned the value error, so understanding value error messages. You cannot convert some value to an integer. For example, we had, I believe at the top, a string of ABC. And then we have a type error, which means that if we're trying to convert a value and it didn't support that specific type, we would be able to print that error out. Then later on, we have a way for us to use it within our branching, our if statements. So if you are wanting to check an age and you want to make sure that that value or that age is less than a certain value, you can use a value error and pass in a string value to be what gets displayed out if it's not, if the individual or the age is not greater than 18. And then we see that we can use try except, and here we've used our try to call our function to check 15 to make sure it works. So this is a form of testing where you can test out your code just to make sure it works, and then you can have a value error to catch your exception with the E. The next thing we have is we actually are using list here and accessing list and using index error message. So this is similar to what you were able to see when you run your code, and maybe when you're using list, you're kind of out of range. This is what gets done behind the scenes. So you're able to write your own. Then here we were able to show one example of actually reading a file. And I showed you guys that and showed you the example of actually creating a text file and reading from it. And then lastly, we have our square root one. So I hope that this video helped you with the code with me and understanding the little error. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. The second part of this is going to be converting our code with me, the video that is already posted, into Streamlit and using Streamlit.